This is the University of Hong Kong, and the title is still the same. It's Colliders with Context, Trees in First-Person Shooter Computer Games. The stage is yours.
Click. Cool. Okay, good afternoon. My paper analyses the tree as an object in first-person shooter games to explore how games can inform and be informed by landscape theory. So trees were selected for this exploration because they're a typical placeholder for the organic world, but also because they have a good degree of variation in their potential symbolic functions. So I demonstrate how methodologies from computer game studies and landscape theory can work together to form a revealing language for understanding computer games as landscapes and as continuations of deeper historical landscape narratives that inform contemporary relationships to the physical environment. So by connecting trees in computer games with trees in historical landscape representations, my paper questions how the history of landscape influences our interpretation of computer games, as well as how the unique affordances of games themselves can transform actively landscape theory. In this presentation, I give an outline of the methodology of my paper and introduce my close reading of Counter-Strike Global Offensive, Metro Last Light, and I give a supplementary example of the game Chasing Dead. Okay, so some starting assumptions. The first is that the tree is there in the game. It's the first point. In the first-person shooter, it can exist as a 2D or 3D game object that has properties variously assigned by the medium of the particular game, understood by the designer in terms such as image sphere, texture, collider, sensor, what have you. How trees are presented in landscapes, both deliberately and unintentionally, express certain cultural expectations of where they should fit as landscape elements, and how they're experienced by the player similarly combines the unique representations made by the game with the historical representations that the player can already start to associate with them. Bjarke Borison's work on the relationship between landscape and computer game experience, and Daniel Beller's research into how games can generate a genius loci are both important backgrounds for my paper. I think my paper sits between these two approaches. I use the tree as a game object with a contextual history to argue that landscape creates meaning via the experience and inhabitation of the player, as well as by the fragments of historical narratives imported by the player's own intertextual associations. My approach anticipates that within any game environment, contradictory fragments of historical ideologies might be contained within the overall assemblage of objects that comprise that environment. So I begin by asking how landscape exists for a player and what different types of player might we be referring to in this discussion of landscape. So Charles Harrison argues that any landscape must be judged according to whom it was intended to affect. So he steers us away from a universalized subject by locating the disinterestedness of vision that's often sort of implied by modernist theory as actually only pertaining to a specific male literate empiricist gentleman. And so he instead argues that it's imperative that we question any assumed audience just as much as we question any assumed experience of a landscape. Similarly, in Borison's paper, he brackets out two specific player perspectives in his discussion on the experience of computer game landscapes. He talks about the competitor, essentially, who moves from amateur to highly skilled, and in doing so learns to basically ignore landscape representations just to see paths and obstacles. And then he talks about this more contemplative player who seeks to overcome the gameplay condition in order to achieve a form of contemplative play, which we might sort of liken to this disinterestedness of vision that Harrison talks about, which is exemplified by in-game photographers. The competitor who ignores the representations of the game environment and the contemplative play will both fit into how I understand what Ollie describes as the first-person player who experiences the game as played, which would then be contrasted by the third person who perceives the game as a system in and of itself. So in my play-based analysis, I bracket my experience in the following ways. I talk about myself as a first-person amateur player. My experience is dominated by my need to survive and satisfy the conditions that allow me to remain in the game. And as an increasingly skillful player, with my ability to easily satisfy these conditions, which then allows me the disinterestedness of vision to contemplate the game world and experiment with my ideas of inhabitation of landscape. My first person and third person analytical perspectives are also moderated by what Ollie describes as the undeniable and the deniable meanings. So I differentiate between those qualities of computer game trees that I observe according to their functional relationship to me as a player. Okay, so just some sort of background of what I mean when and how I'm using landscape theory. The initial problem is the referential ambiguity of the term landscape, which is a constant sort of bugbear in landscape theory. The history of the term oscillates between the physical environment, the act of altering the physical environment, as well as representations of the physical environment. And due to the historical inseparability of these aspects, I use the term landscape embracing this ambiguity. However, when I want to be more specific, I'll say representation or physical environment. The point of this paper is not just to see how computer game landscapes can carry landscape narratives, but to question how computer games might also be altering and restructuring functions of landscape theory. In a 2008 seminar on landscape theory, essentially the scholarly debate outlined a methodology that was sort of the result of an argument between a phenomenology of experience negotiated against the invisible trace of cultural and historical narratives. Arguing in favour of a phenomenology of landscape, Jennifer Jane Marshall said that the problem with cultural and historical narrative is that they can function as an outright truth that will preclude any sort of possible experience we can have of landscape. Edward Casey, again I use a lot in my paper, he talks about taking a phenomenological approach. He defines landscape representation as a functional process of placemaking where landscape imaging requires us to shift away from the desire to represent the impossible totality of a location and towards the desire to re-emplace the experience of a location into a graphic form. The landscape representation then encapsulates the sense of place that results from our interaction with the location. And this interaction is constantly influenced by the historical relationship between representation and location as a sort of a back and forth process. In other words, Casey is saying, again, that image and environment are in this sort of inseparable dynamic relationship. Casey also introduces the phrase a chorographic region, which is the bare minimum vocabulary of landscape qualities that this process of representation creates that gives us a way to conceptualize the impossible complexity of the physical environment and gives us these ideas of place and region. He's essentially saying landscape is that which creates these conceptions. Casey's determination that landscape creates region via a simplification of environment, to me immediately, it has a strong correlation to Gonzalo Frasca's definition of simulation as an active modelling system A by a less complex system B. I go into this more a bit in the paper. So on the total other hand, this phenomenology of landscape, art historians like Robin Kelsey argue that alongside any phenomenology of landscape, there has to be a recognition that, especially in the Western landscape tradition, it's deeply influenced by trace histories which are essentially, can be invisible to a phenomenology of experience. And to support his sort of cultural historical theory of landscape, he proposes this sort of umbrella term for Western landscape as in general embodying the repression of the desire not to belong to the world and an assumption of human exceptionalism, and he uses this to characterise various historical representations. Within computer game studies, I locate the importance of trace histories alongside the experience of the player within a new game. Michael Nietzsche's use of the term evocative narrative elements to describe how a player derives meaning from game objects within a spatially oriented experience. I use this in combination with Jesper Juhl's analysis of the fiction and simulated, where he demonstrates that representations within computer games give the player initial clues as to how objects function, which in turn rely on the player's previous experience with computer games, but as well their sort of general visual literacy. So for the purpose of my paper, I sort of summarise this into what I call a basic receptivity to intertextuality, based on the player's unique set of cultural reference points. So positioning myself as a contemplative player, I locate my in-game experience also alongside my position as a scholar of landscape. So when studying a game from a third-person perspective, I don't assume a universal subject with the same experiential background or desires to find landscape that I have, but I speculate from my observations as to whether my own intertextual readings can make a valuable contribution to the discourse surrounding the meanings of the game, but also its significance to our understandings of landscape theory. Okay, so to summarise all that, my final methodology combining these perspectives is what I'll now talk about in my analysis of Counter-Strike, Metro Last Light and Chasing Dead. So I begin with the first-person experiential account of trees in each game, and I note sort of the perspectives from which I make these observations. From a third-person perspective, I make observations and judgments about the context and role of trees within each game system. Then, considering the functions of emplacement and the representation of a region, I locate each game tree in a broader context of landscape created by the game, and how this can be understood using a receptivity to intertextuality and trace histories. So to realise the purpose of this analysis, I consider how the appropriation and resampling of landscape elements within the affordances offered by the computer games expands the possible functions generally of landscape theory. Okay, so my first case study in this paper is Counter-Strike Global Offensive and the militia map in particular. So from my first-person amateur perspective, it's a fast-paced multiplayer FPS with rules that to me are essentially very comparable to games of tag, cops and robbers, paintball, etc. So the haste and rapid optical targeting of this game means that the only pause I have for landscape contemplation is when I've been killed, or when my character's been killed, and I watch the remainder of the round from the perspective of other players. The haste of Counter-Strike requires that all players memorise the strategic architecture of each map, but despite this severe condition, the rich variety of Counter-Strike maps available form an important part of the sort of collective experience of this game, as it's sort of evidenced through discussion boards, what have you. So yeah, so my case study here is the militia terrain map created by Andrew Oman. In this case, playing myself as an FBI agent, I begin militia in a representation of a driveway outside an American farm, where armoured FBI trucks are parked outside next to a cornfield, and we all run in and take positions behind boulders and grain silos and oak trees as a melee ensues with the terrorist players who sort of spill out from the main farmhouse. The tree is a dominant visual feature in the militia game map. In my amateur play, the trees have the deniable quality of representing, I think, large oak and small birch trees. Within the pathable space of the map, all the trees share the undeniable quality of shielding me from the vision and gunfire of enemy players. So in this sense, they're essentially the same as a rock or a wall. They can't be climbed, their branches don't blow in the wind, their root structures don't seem to interfere with any of the tunnels underneath them, etc. Haste and visual targeting therefore homogenise my experience of objects into shelter and non-pathable space. Upon third-person reflection, this map recalls the notorious real-world standoffs between the FBI and militia groups, such as Ruby Ridge, Idaho, 1992, Waco, Texas, 93, and more recently, the Malta wildlife standoff this year. So I'd say generally that in the militia map, I play cops and robbers through a first-person shooter skinned with this representation of the North American militia movement. The significance of trees in militia, to me, is therefore twofold. The farm hostage scenario contextualises the fictional relationship between the American FBI and the terrorists. From a third-person perspective, the fictional context emplaces the identifiable trope of the Midwest American farm, which is widely agreed as sort of the setting of this map in online forums. In the socio-political context of the American farm, the object of the oak and birch trees are identifiable, therefore, within Casey's concept of emplacing a region. From a third-person historical perspective, it's also possible to examine why an oak tree might be an anticipated component of this region, given that with a very small sidestep into Western art history, there is a glut of historical, political and mythological references to oak trees. Of relevance here, the oak tree was a key nationalistic symbol and a contested commodity in 18th century England and landscape aesthetics at the time, in particular because at that time the demands of the shipbuilding industry produced such a shortage of these slow-growing trees that for any agricultural property to plant these and to have them represented in landscape images was a legible sign of nationalism and citizenship. And in 2004, United States Congress legislated to make the oak tree the national tree of America due to its associations with resilience and toughness. Okay, so I can't assume that an ideal player or modder has consciously built these narratives into their game experience. That'd be crazy. But if I position militia as a convincing emplacement of a region, this might support the argument that the player thinks oak trees belong in this landscape, and so therefore connecting them to these sort of deeper appropriated symbolisms of oak trees. Okay, so in my close reading of militia, I made 3 determinations of tree. Collision objects in a game of tag, representational props that emplace the American rural militia siege, and intertextual tropes with a deep history. And so I simplify this to collision objects with a context, where the game experience is enhanced by the sensual quality afforded by the game environment, which is based on an exploitation of existing cultural references. Okay, so my second case study, another FPS, is 4A Games' Metro Last Light from the Metro series. This game presents a single-player game world based on the post-apocalyptic version of Moscow, presented in Dmitry Glukhovsky's book Metro 2033. My first-person experience in this game is divided between essentially 3 represented environments. These underground bunkers, the sort of catacomb labyrinths, and the outdoor post-apocalyptic landscape. And collectively, these environments give me a different experience of what I call undeniable environmental threat. In the bunker, I combat human NPCs by stealth. In the catacomb, I combat light-sensitive mutant spiders. And in the outdoor post-apocalyptic landscape, I have to move rapidly to combat fast-moving monsters while the landscape itself attacks me with unbreathable toxic air. So realising that I'm constrained by limited supply of gas masks outside and these fast-moving enemies, I essentially blunder through the hazardous outdoors past checkpoints, which eventually lead me back to the relative calm of these claustrophobic underground environments. As I then transition from an amateur to a player with this ability for contemplation, I've learnt tricks to conserve my gas masks, and I've become more adept at knocking off the NPC monsters, so I can start to peek around at this generally quite terrifying and desolate landscape. And broadly speaking, the post-apocalyptic plot of the game is articulated by these sort of contrasting modes of threat that I experience. In their non-visual representation, the trees in this game fulfill the peripheral role that I'd expect to find in a first-person shooter. They're colliders that protect me from either gunfire or proximity attacks. And as a contemplative player receptive to intertextuality, I recognise their deniable visual representations as being connected to sort of romantic visual tropes. As seen here, the German romantic painter Caspar David Friedrich exemplified this use of twisted gnarled trees in the 19th century to embody his perception of nature, in this case as a physical manifestation of the divine, as well as that from which humanity has been exiled. Metro Last Light represents environmental threat by darkness and vulnerability, and an environment that has exiled humanity, the air chokes player. By associating this landscape with the language of Robert Kelsey, I argue that the game simulates for the player the romantic separation of humans from nature and the rejection of humanity's animality. The object of landscape and its new resident monsters attack me while I sort of sprint across the wasteland, frantically shooting before my gas mask expires and I choke to death. This exile of humanity, where nature flourishes in society's absence, also corresponds to 2 of Kelsey's 6 categories of not belonging. The unilateral, where the earth is obdurate and resilient, and so our belonging is not required, and the nostalgic romantic, where we don't belong, but we once did, and we long to do so again. A receptivity to intertextuality can allow me to consider how the visual representation of gnarled trees in Metro can be connected to the romantic trees of Caspar David Friedrich, and therefore to a longer history of landscapes as not belonging. So I argue that as colliders with context here, the trees perform an active role in creating a world that humanity has been exiled from, that also suggests a particularly romantic yearning for reconciliation. So the last little contrasting example for Metro is 2020 Ventures game from this year, Chasing Dead. Also a post-apocalyptic FPS. It shares a sort of genre similarity to Metro, but has an interesting contrast in the representation of trees. In my first-person experience of Undeniable Threat, it's not created by the representation of poisonous air or especially dangerous NPCs, but through a pretty weird implementation of game physics. In Chasing Dead, the trees are the only landscape objects that have no collision properties, so I can walk or drive my tank straight through them. The enemy NPCs appear to operate with a follow command script that tracks me as soon as I trigger a particular area of the map, which means that once I've triggered that area, I can run into a house, it doesn't matter, they'll keep finding me. So this combination of physics and programming presents an unexpected challenge. If I enter a forest, I can't see the approaching mutants, but they can see me, because essentially they don't see the trees like I do. So the post-apocalyptic landscape of this game might suggest initially this sort of similar romantic reading to Metro, but the unconventional physics leads me to a totally different relationship. The trees have become an environmental threat because they don't exist for the NPCs, which also starts to resemble an inversion of J. Appleton's prospect refuge theory, where the desire for landscape to function as a prospect or refuge, putting me in a position of power and control, is totally confounded by the exposed position of being seen without seeing. This could easily be disregarded, obviously, as a flaw in game design, but to me it's an interesting example of what happens when a game breaks with the expectations of its genre. When a tree becomes different from a rock or a wall in its physics representation that usually treats them all the same, the undeniable meaning of the tree shifts completely. So in relation to kaleidoscopic context, this example illustrates how the intertextual associations of the post-apocalyptic tree remain in a dynamic relationship with the undeniable meanings created by the game system itself. Okay, so I'll just quickly conclude. So I've created a position where landscape can be considered in computer games by the experience of emplacement and the receptivity to intertextuality. If we question how games contribute to the genre of landscape, I argue that games reveal meaning through the combination of historical references and the undeniable meanings they make for the player. The context of my enjoyment of Cops and Robbers prompted my speculation on the relationship between emplacement and the trajectories of landscape history from nationalism to pastoralism to the militia movement. The sensation of asphyxiating in exile procedurally highlighted the emotional yearning that's embedded within a romantic view of landscape coupled with an eco-apocalypse. The unfair contradiction of a forest that only I could see was a revealing inversion of the strategic advantage generally enjoyed with prospect refuge theory. So by considering these game trees alongside landscape theory, we can start to question how representations have intertextual precedence and also how variations made within the game system can add a completely new vector to alter our understanding of these same histories and their relationship to landscape theory. That's it.
Thank you, Peter. And questions, please.
Thanks for a great presentation. Are you familiar with a first-person shooter called Papa Sangre? Papa Sangre. So we're talking about a first-person shooter in which is actually an audio game. So you don't have any visual output in this game. How does this kind of first-person shooter experience match with your ideas? Are we still talking about representation? How does the perception of landscape rely on visual perception? Can we also perceive the landscape via oral means?
That's kind of interesting, because that was the exact same sort of question and criticism that was brought up in the PhD consortium with my presentation on Monday. And one of the sort of like get out of jail free cards I try to put in my paper is that the limitation of the possibility space I come up with in trees is limited to the case studies that I use in the paper, so it's automatically skewed to, from my experience, then the theoretical and historical reference points that I try to link to it. So unfortunately my answer is that I need to play that game and sort of have a think about it to answer the question. Because I can't see an immediate yes or no, because one of the things I have to fight against from my background in art history was a purely visual analysis where I'm like, here's a screenshot that looks like this painting, bang, connection. So I had to kind of work away from that. So the best I could do, I guess, is play the game and have a think about it.
How about like landscape theory in general? Do they talk about these other means of perception?
Yeah, certainly. Like the nice thing with landscape theory is its ambiguity and its multidisciplinarity. So obviously in art history it will sort of have a predominantly visual focus, but moving through landscape architecture and geography, they will become sort of less biased towards one particular sensorial input. So I imagine if you sort of block off visual representation immediately, the parallels you might start to look at that are relevant and informative to the game, it's highly likely they'll come from other areas of landscape theory, particularly say something like landscape architecture or urban architecture or something like that.
Awesome, thanks.
Thank you. I was wondering if I thought it was easier to follow the oak tree example and the references you made to the history of the US and how it was contextualized. I had a bit of a problem with the Caspar David Friedrich because I was wondering, well, isn't that the easiest example to come up with? And I was wondering if you would look into surrealism, Max Ernst or whatever. I mean, is it maybe reasonable to go back to these canonic artists because they are also widely known with programmers and people who program these games? Or do you really think that like romanticism within art history is the period that one would have to look at first and not surrealism as an example or more recent?
Yeah, that's a good question because I might fall into the same traps of cliche that I would be intending to criticise in the qualities of spaces that people create. So I might be just as guilty as going for the obvious there, but then by the same token, perhaps that also suggests an obvious starting point. Maybe that's where I should start. If there are these visual tropes that are tropes to the point of cliche, establishing whether, to me it seems relevant to establish whether there's more than a visual relationship, whether there's a theoretical or an ideological relationship between why that particular representation was used yet again. To me there was enough interesting material there to discuss, particularly in that example, that their version of a post-apocalyptic landscape was cliche built on cliche. It was also a genre of a post-apocalyptic landscape that is built as much on perhaps vague memories of canonical works of landscape painting as much as it's built on films like Escape from New York or Terminator 2 or the sort of multitude of the eco-apocalypse, nuclear apocalypse landscape. So yeah, I don't know, it made sense to me to start in the obvious place because it seemed like such an easy link to justify both visually and ideologically. But maybe now having done that, it would make sense to move away from such a typical point of reference. Does that answer?
I also have a question. Could you follow you? Because like one of my most striking game experiences was when I was able to shoot off the leaves of a palm tree in Far Cry. So that's really impressive. But what I wanted to ask you is, how would you call that kind of research? Is it looking into the paratext of a game? Because just for a second I thought of an art historian who looks at paintings to be found in porn movies, right? So why do you do that? Okay, obviously that guy wanted to watch the movie, but it's not only that you want to make a first-person shooter, right?
So the main motivation behind my PhD in general is I thought, and I think it's relevant to call computer game designers to account for the visual appropriations that appear regardless of whether they're deliberate or not. Like my general hope is to create, so there's a metaphor of fragmented landscape narratives that's used to describe, this might sound obscure, but to describe Qing Dynasty painting, posited by James Elkins, which is that he calls it an endgame eclipse, where an endgame in chess, there's not many pieces left and all you can do is shuffle them around until there's no possible win stake for anyone. He argued that in Qing Dynasty painting, the Chinese painting at that time had a modularity to it where it was this recycling ad absurdum of modular components. So you can look at every painting as sort of a recycling of a visual lexicon that's already familiar to both the artists and the audiences of these work. And so therefore the narrative of those paintings can also be looked at as these sort of Frankenstein ahistorical mashups of the history that had come before them. And so I'm sort of curious as to see whether that argument can be made for the way that game worlds are created and the way that assets are deployed. Some, like a Counter-Strike's a good example because it's a sort of mod-based maps. But in general, I have this fascination with perceiving landscapes as these sort of appropriated Frankensteins of various historical references, some of which are weak to the point of irrelevance, but some of them might be strong enough that we can sort of justify bringing them up. So that's sort of the motivation for looking at things in this particular way.
Thank you, Peter.